In the dry, cracked summer of 1987, a 27-year-old Della Oaks stood at the edge of 40 acres of dying orchard and made a decision that would cause the entire county of Harlan, Tennessee, to question her sanity. The trees were still standing. That was the cruel part. They hadn't fallen, hadn't been cleared, hadn't given anyone the decency of a clean break. They simply stood there, gray and skeletal against a white August sky, their roots rotting from a fungal blight that had moved through the hollow 3 seasons ago and taken everything with it. The previous owner, a widower named Mr. Tackett, whose family had worked that land for 4 generations, had walked away from it the way a man walks away from a funeral. Slowly, and without looking back, he'd priced it at what amounted to pocket change for a farm of that size, and still it had sat on the market for 14 months. Della had driven up the gravel road in her father's borrowed truck on a Tuesday in July, stepped out into the heat, and stood very still for a long time. Her friend Joanna, who had driven with her for moral support, lasted about 4 minutes before she said quietly but plainly, "Della, no." Della didn't answer. She was looking at the tree line on the western edge of the property, where a natural spring fed a narrow creek that wound through the low ground. She was looking at the gentle slope of the land, the way it fell by degrees toward a wide, shallow depression at the center of the acreage that the dead trees ringed like mourners around a grave. She was looking at the shape of the hollow itself, the way the hillsides cupped it, the particular color of the soil near the creek bank. She was seeing something Joanna wasn't. She made an offer that afternoon. Mr. Tackett, who was 71 years old and living in his daughter's spare bedroom in Knoxville, accepted it within the hour. He didn't ask questions. He thanked her. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been allowed to set it down. Let me tell you about Della Oaks before I go any further, because you need to understand who she was before you can understand what she did. She had grown up on the far side of that same county, in a house her grandmother, Iris Oaks, had built with her second husband on 12 acres of unremarkable hillside. Iris was not a woman anyone in Harlan County would have called extraordinary. She kept a large kitchen garden, raised a few pigs, maintained a small flock of Rhode Island Reds, and traded eggs and preserved goods with her neighbors through a system of quiet reciprocity that predated the concept of a farmer's market by several decades. She spoke little about what she was doing and why. She simply did it. But what Iris did that set her apart from every other small farmer in that county was this: she composted everything. Not in the polite, decorative way that people today keep a small bin near the back door. Iris composted with the seriousness of a person who believed truly and structurally that nothing that came from the earth should leave it. Kitchen scraps, wood ash, the bedding from the chicken coop, the stalks of last year's garden, the deadfall from the tree line, all of it was gathered, layered, turned, and returned. Her soil was dark and deep in a way that her neighbors' plots simply weren't. And when Della was a girl of 9 or 10, she had knelt beside her grandmother in the garden and pushed her small hand into the earth up to the wrist and marveled at how soft it was, how alive it felt, how it didn't compact around her fingers the way the dirt in the yard did. "Why is it different?" she had asked. Iris had looked at her with the patient expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for exactly this question. "Because I feed it," she said. "Most people take from the ground. They plant, they harvest, they take. I give back first. Always give back first." That was the whole lesson. Della was 9 years old. It took her the next 18 years to understand fully what her grandmother had meant. Iris died when Della was 22, leaving behind a house that went to Della's uncle, a small savings account that was divided 3 ways among her children, and a series of handwritten composition notebooks that nobody else wanted. They were dense with observations, planting dates, weather notes, soil descriptions, sketches of drainage patterns, records of which cover crops had done what to the soil the following season. They were not organized in any way that made obvious sense. They were the private language of a woman thinking out loud over 40 years of close attention. Della took the notebooks. She had read them so many times that certain passages had worn soft at the edges from the oil of her fingers. When she bought the Tackett property, she was not operating on a whim or on grief or on the desperate logic of a person with no other options. She was operating on something she had been building quietly inside herself for years. She had a plan, and it was rooted in her grandmother's notebooks. And it was, by every reasonable measure, considered completely ridiculous by everyone who heard it. The blight that had killed the orchard was a soil-borne fungal pathogen, the kind that thrives in compacted, poorly draining earth. Mr. Tackett had farmed the conventional way, synthetic inputs, no cover cropping, deep tillage that disrupted the fungal networks in the soil and left it vulnerable. Once the pathogen got in, there was nothing to fight back. The land had no immune system left. Most people, looking at that orchard, saw a dead farm. They saw a liability, a cleanup job, 40 acres of firewood and future debt. Della saw a farm that had been mined to exhaustion and then abandoned. She saw soil that was damaged but not dead. She saw a natural spring that had never been properly used. She saw a depression at the center of the property that, with minimal earthwork, could hold water. And she saw the specific, patient work it would take to bring it back, not through chemicals and force, but through rebuilding from the ground up, literally. The plan was this. First, she would not clear the dead orchard. She would cut the trees at the base, leave the root systems to break down slowly in the ground, and chip the wood into mulch. The roots, as they decomposed, would open channels in the compacted soil. The mulch, spread deep over the ground, would suppress the competing weeds, retain moisture, and begin the long process of feeding the soil microbiome. It would take time. It would take more time than most people were willing to wait. Second, she would establish a composting system on a scale that most people in Harlan County had never seen outside of a municipal operation. She made arrangements with 3 local restaurants, a school cafeteria, and a produce wholesaler to collect their organic waste. She negotiated with a nearby horse stable for their spent bedding. She sourced spent grain from a small brewery in the next town over. All of it would go into a series of large windrow compost piles on the high ground of the property. All of it would eventually go back into the earth. Third, and this was the part that made people look at her sideways when she explained it, she would use the natural depression at the center of the property to create a small system of ponds connected to the spring. Not decorative ponds, working ponds. She would raise freshwater mussels. Now, let me explain why this matters, because I think most people, when they hear freshwater mussels, picture something small and irrelevant. Freshwater mussels are one of the most efficient biological filtration systems in nature. A single adult mussel can filter up to 15 gallons of water per day, extracting algae, bacteria, fine particles of organic matter. They clean water the way a kidney cleans blood. In a farm setting, water that runs off fields carries with it nitrogen, phosphorus, and other compounds that accumulate in ponds and create problems. Mussels solve that problem without chemistry, and in doing so, they grow. They produce a shell that, when ground, becomes a calcium-rich soil amendment. Their soft tissue, mixed back into compost, accelerates the breakdown process dramatically. They were not a side project. They were a critical node in a system she was building. The same way crawfish had been a critical node in a system someone else had built once, in a different state, on a different kind of broken land. Two incomes from one system. The mussels themselves had commercial value to aquaculture suppliers and conservation groups working on stream restoration. The compost she was building would be sold to nurseries and market gardens within a 100-mile radius. The land, once it recovered, would be replanted with a mixed orchard of heritage varieties and native fruit trees that didn't require the chemical inputs a monoculture apple or peach operation demanded. She explained this to Mr. Hendricks at the Harlan County Farm Credit Office in September of that year. She had typed up a 3-page summary, brought her grandmother's notebooks as reference material, and wore the one blazer she owned. Mr. Hendricks was the kind of man whose skepticism came dressed in the language of concern. He listened to her with his hands folded on his desk and the expression of someone watching a child try to carry too many things at once. He was not a cruel man. That was important to understand. He was a man who had seen 100 ambitious plans dissolve in the particular reality of East Tennessee agriculture, and who had learned to protect the institution he worked for by protecting it from optimism. "Miss Oakes," he said, with the careful patience of someone who had rehearsed this kind of conversation many times, "what you're describing is not a farm plan. It's a science project." He paused. "Freshwater mussels, composting partnerships. You're talking about 3 to 5 years before this property generates meaningful revenue. The land has negative value right now. We can't extend credit against a negative asset." He leaned forward slightly. "I knew your grandmother. Fine woman. She kept a nice garden. But what you're describing here is something else entirely. You'd need infrastructure, permits for the ponds, equipment for the composting operation. Where is any of that coming from?" Della looked at him for a moment. "From the work," she said. He blinked. "I'll build what I can build. I'll source what I can source for nothing, and I'll grow into the rest." He shook his head slowly, not unkindly. "I can't approve this loan." She thanked him for his time. She gathered her grandmother's notebooks. She walked out. Have you ever stood in a parking lot after being told no, definitively no, by the one person whose yes you needed, and had to decide in that moment what kind of person you were going to be? Not in the broad, philosophical sense, in the immediate, practical sense. Because the abstract version of yourself, the one who had always believed you were the kind of person who would not give up, had to meet the concrete version of yourself, standing in a hot parking lot in September, holding a stack of old notebooks, with a truck borrowed from your father and 40 acres of dead orchard waiting for you. That was Della's moment. She stood by the truck for a while. Then she drove to the property. She started the next morning. What followed was 2 years of work so physically demanding that her body changed shape doing it. Her hands, which had been the hands of a woman who had worked hard but not like this, became something else. Calloused, thickened at the knuckles, quick in a way that hands become when they are doing the same tasks 10,000 times. She rose before light. She worked until she could not. She slept without difficulty. She spent the first 3 months removing the dead orchard, cutting each tree at the base with a chainsaw she had borrowed, and then bought secondhand when she realized she was going to need it. Indefinitely, feeding the wood through a chipper she rented on weekends and couldn't always afford, she piled the chips in long windrows along the contours of the slope and let the first rains of autumn begin pressing them into the soil. She left every root system intact, every stump flush with the ground, and watched the first green things appear in the spring, the decomposers, fungi and bacteria, and the small creatures that eat them, beginning their quiet work. She dug the first pond by hand, and with a rented excavator, she operated herself after watching 3 YouTube videos and spending one afternoon beaching it in the creek and spending another afternoon getting it out. The pond was roughly half an acre, fed by a diversion from the spring through a simple gravity flow pipe she'd laid herself. She sourced her first mussels from a state conservation hatchery that was, she discovered through persistent phone calls, actually quite pleased to find someone willing to create habitat for them. The composting operation grew by accretion. The restaurant partnerships required her to drive to town twice a week with a trailer. The horse stable required a relationship, which required showing up, which required time she didn't have. She showed up anyway. The brewery spent grain required a conversation with the owner, Mr. Sorensen, a young man her own age, who had started the brewery himself 2 years prior and who looked at her composting proposal with the particular interest of someone who had been paying to have a problem removed and was now being offered an alternative. He said yes immediately and helped her load the first trailer himself. The neighbors watched. They always watch, in the way that rural communities have always watched the people among them who do things differently, with a compound expression that contains, depending on the day, curiosity and doubt, and the particular kind of interest that people have in a story whose ending they haven't decided yet. Her nearest neighbor was a man named Mr. Caldwell, who ran a conventional beef cattle operation on the ridge above her property, and who had bid on the Tackett land himself before she had, intending to expand his grazing acreage. He was not hostile, but he was watching. He stopped her at the end of her driveway one morning in her second spring. Leaning out of the window of his truck with his engine still running, the way farmers do when they've stopped to say something quick. "Those ponds," he said. "You doing something with mussels down there?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, looking past her toward the lower field where the second pond was half dug. "How's it working?" "Ask me in a year," she said. He nodded again and drove on. It was not unfriendly. It was the way men like him communicated the fact that they were paying attention. The cold knot of doubt, the one she had been managing, the way you manage a chronic injury, with constant small adjustments and careful avoidance of certain movements, arrived in full force in the February of her second winter. The compost operation was running. The first pond was established. The mussels were alive. She could see them in the shallows on clear days, their dark shells half buried in the soft sediment. The mulched ground was beginning to show real change. The soil samples she sent to the extension lab had come back with improving numbers, organic matter up by nearly 2 points, a significant change in 18 months. But money was nearly gone. She had sold compost. She had sold some mussels to a restoration project in the next county. It had not been enough. She sat at the kitchen table of the small farmhouse she'd been slowly repairing on the property, looking at a bank statement that did not leave her with many options, and let herself, for about 20 minutes, feel the full weight of the possibility that everyone had been right. Then she made 3 phone calls. The first was to a landscape architecture firm in Asheville that she had read about in a trade publication, which had been doing work on rain garden installations and bioswale systems for commercial properties. She offered them a compost supply contract at a price she'd calculated would keep her solvent for another 6 months. They asked for a sample. She drove it to them the following week. They signed a contract the week after that. The second call was to a culinary instructor at a community college in Knoxville who ran a local sourcing program for the college's hospitality students. She offered freshwater mussel tastings and farm visits. The instructor, a woman named Ms. Darrow, who turned out to have a deep personal interest in native species cuisine, drove to the farm herself within the week. She stayed for 3 hours. She brought a notebook. The third call was to her father to tell him she was going to be all right. She was not entirely certain that was true when she said it, but it became true faster than she had expected. The landscape firm's contract led to 2 others through referral. The culinary program brought journalists, who brought readers, who brought restaurant buyers. The mussels she had raised were genuinely exceptional. Clean and complex flavored in a way that farm-raised bivalves rarely are, a direct result of the clean spring water and the controlled environment she had created. A restaurant in Nashville contacted her in the spring of her 3rd year. Then a second one. The farm changed, not in the showy, visible way of large machinery and new buildings. It changed the way healthy things change, gradually, from the inside out. The soil on the western slope, the first ground she had mulched and composted, was now genuinely remarkable. A soil scientist from the state university came out in her 4th year because someone had sent him her extension lab numbers, and he hadn't believed them. He walked the slope and was quiet for a while and then said, in the careful way that scientists say things they are still processing, "This is 15 years of work in 4 years." "How?" my grandmother Della said, "and a lot of horse manure." He asked if he could bring students. He brought them every semester for the next 3 years. In the spring of her 6th year on the property, Mr. Caldwell came back. Not at the end of the driveway this time. He drove down to the farmhouse and knocked on the porch door, his hat in his hands, in the way that men his age hold their hats when they've come to say something that cost them something to say. She offered him coffee. He accepted. They sat on the porch in the morning light, and he looked out over the lower field, where the first mixed orchard she had replanted was 3 years old now. Small but established, its root systems reaching down into soil that barely resembled the dead clay that had been there 6 years ago. The ponds were clear and productive. The compost windrows on the high ground had been in continuous operation long enough that the ground beneath them had become something extraordinary. "I did the math," Mr. Caldwell said finally. "Your per-acre net. Someone told me the number." He shook his head. "That's not possible with 40 acres. It's 110 now," she said. She had been buying the surrounding parcels as they came available, all of them land her neighbors had considered marginal, rocky, wet, or otherwise difficult. All of them paid for in cash. He sat with that for a moment. How do you keep the soil from burning out? I lose my best pasture every 8 years, have to reseed, rest it. The cost is, he trailed off. You're not feeding it, she said. You're only taking. He looked at her, and in his face, she saw the same expression that her grandmother had worn when she had asked the right question as a 9-year-old in the garden. The patient expression of someone who has been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for exactly this conversation. She spent 2 hours explaining it to him. She showed him the notebooks. He left with a soil amendment plan she'd written out by hand, on the back of an envelope, and the address of the brewery where he could arrange to collect the spent grain himself. He did not say he had been wrong. Men like him rarely did, explicitly. But he came back the following spring when to tell her the pasture on his south ridge was doing something it hadn't done in 30 years, and the way he said, it carried everything he hadn't said directly. She understood. Let me take the long view now. Della Oaks never made the farm into something that required a fleet of equipment or a staff of 20. She expanded slowly and deliberately, always buying land that others had written off, always paying cash, always working the same patient system. The mixed orchard came into full production in her 8th year and generated revenue she hadn't projected for another 2 seasons. Because the heritage varieties she had chosen, guided by her grandmother's notes on Iris's own long ago observations about what grew well in that particular hollow, turned out to be extraordinarily well suited to the soil she had rebuilt. A regional food magazine ran a piece on the farm in her 9th year. A documentary crew came in her 11th. She didn't particularly like the attention, but she understood its value, and she was patient with it. What she cared about was the soil. Every year she sent samples from across the property to the same lab, and every year she charted the results in a composition notebook, the same kind her grandmother had used, filling them up in the same dense private handwriting, noting what had worked and what hadn't, what the land seemed to want, and what it had resisted, what questions remained open. There was a girl, her neighbor's daughter, from the next farm over, who started coming around when she was about 12. Her name was Wren. She had the quality that curious children have of being very quiet and very present, and she would follow Della through the composting operation, or along the pond banks without saying much, just watching, the way Della herself had once followed her grandmother. One afternoon in the late summer of Della's 15th year on the property, they were sitting at the edge of the largest pond in the low evening light, watching the mussels work in the shallows, the water so clear you could see the fine movement of sediment where they filtered. Wren said, "Why doesn't everybody do it this way?" Della was quiet for a moment. "Because it's slow," she said, "and it asks you to trust something you can't see yet. Most people don't want to wait for proof before they commit. They want to see the answer before they ask the question." Wren thought about this. "But you did it. I had my grandmother's notebooks," Della said. "I wasn't trusting something I couldn't see. I was trusting something she had already seen. I was standing on her proof." She pulled one of the older notebooks from the canvas bag she always carried in the field and set it on the grass between them. Wren looked at it but didn't touch it yet. "Someday," Della said, "if you want it, this is yours." The county that had once watched Della Oaks drive down a gravel road toward 40 acres of dead orchard and shaken its collective head was now quietly asking her questions, not in any official or celebrated way, in the particular way of rural communities that have adjusted their opinion of something, without quite admitting they ever had a different one. The farmers who came to her asked about soil health, about water management, about the composting partnerships, about cover crops. She answered all of it, every time, because her grandmother had never once kept a secret of what she knew, and neither would she. The land that everyone said was dead was not dead. It was waiting. It was waiting for someone to understand that the problem was not the land. The problem was the relationship to it. Della had simply offered it a different one, and the land, patient and knowing, had answered in the only language it knows. Slow, steady, unglamorous growth that once it begins, does not stop.